I'm Mark Zyla. I'm principal horn of the Quad City Symphony Orchestra. I'm sitting here with Jacob Bancks, who is the composer of Into the Wild, which is a piece that will be featured on Masterworks 2, Postcards from the Wild West. You wrote a piece for us a few years ago,
Yeah.
Rock Island Line, which, it seems to be a fantastically successful piece.
Yes, by my standard of success, very successful.
The symphony players still talk about it.
That's great.
Here and there.
That's
and,
great.
when I'm caught behind a train every once in a while, I'll take a video and send it to my friends of me singing the melody from that piece.
That's awesome.
But,
yeah.
Can you think back a little bit to that? That was the first time you wrote for the symphony.
Yeah.
So this was the beginning of a long relationship.
Yes.
It seems now.
Yeah.
And so talked about when you met Mark Russell Smith and all that kind of stuff. How did that piece actually come to be?
Yeah, I don't know that Mark Russell Smith and I met much before the first rehearsal. In fact, I think the first time Mark Russell Smith and I met was the first rehearsal, the Wednesday rehearsal of Rock Island Line. The first time we'd met in person. What impressed me the most was sort of how he seemed to get the music very, very instinctively. That sounds sort of it's a very lame thing that people sort of say all the time, right? I mean, he's just has really strong instincts, or he's a very musical person. Mm-hmm. But those things are true. I mean, in my best collaborations, including those with Maestro Smith, that has been the experience, which is just like, I don't really need to explain much to you, clearly. I mean, we have some fun-spirited disagreements about how things should go.
Right.
But that's actually half of the joy of the collaboration. Mm-hmm. It's just, you want piccolo there? That's crazy. No, we don't want that. Or, why didn't you do this? So, but that's all just fun. It's really, that's an enjoyable part of the process. So I won't say, it's just, we don't have some kind of Vulcan mind meld. Obviously, we have our own thoughts, but that's been one of the great privileges. But again, that happened days before Rock Island Line premiered, and so yeah, that's kind of how it started, and I've been very, very privileged to have the chance to continue to work with the orchestra.
This was a commission by the Greater Twin Cities Youth Symphony.
Correct.
And they were headed to Argentina.
Yep.
Right. And so can you tell me a little bit about maybe you're in the Quad Cities.
Yeah.
You've written for the Quad Cities Symphony before. You're being asked to write a piece for another ensemble that Mark Russell Smith conducts. And can you talk to me a little bit about how much the QCSO was on your mind during the composition process?
Yeah.
And then also to me, Mark Russell Smith is Mark Russell Smith in every element that you put him in.
Yeah.
And so what are the similarities and differences between working with Mark with the QCSO and with a student ensemble?
So, yeah, I will say first of all that many of my formative musical experiences were in youth symphony in what was then called the Sioux Empire Youth Symphony in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, actually. So it wasn't hard for me to picture the musicians that I would be writing for, but every project, and it's sort of a funny that you bring this up because I think this is starting to be true. Every project is really for whoever I'm writing after. Sure. That said, it has occurred to me, and it seems to have occurred to you too, that because I go to the Quad City Symphony concerts and I admire the musicians of that orchestra so much and know them well, many of them, and that the QCSO sounds sort of strange to say is sort of my default orchestra. I was very surprised, pleasantly surprised, when I heard that Mark had programmed Into the Wild here, that it surprised me, but then it made sense, and then as you say, you sort of start to point out this solo will be played awesomely by this particular player. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh yeah, I guess that kind of makes sense. So I hope any future orchestral piece I write will find a home in the Quad City Symphony because it probably is in the back of my mind written for them anyway.
Yeah, one of the things I love most about QCSO, and it seems a little bit ridiculous for me to be saying it because I'm one of the people on stage. One thing I really appreciate is that this orchestra has a character to it, and
no question.
That in the music making process, we're kind of able to be ourselves, and so when Andy Parker plays an oboe solo,
absolutely.
That's Andy Parker playing that oboe solo, and then the Quad City Symphony horn section. I always have to mention that.
Well, of course,
and but we sometimes say to one another, when we do a Brahms symphony, Mark ruined Brahms too for us, because when we go and play with another orchestra, it's not that same vibrant,
Absolutely.
like true feeling like we get on stage here.
That is true. That there is a character that emerges when the orchestra works together the way that they do,
Right.
and yeah, it's great.
And I just have a story that
Yeah.
you ran into me in the hallway here at Augustana.
Yeah.
And, being personnel manager, I know who's on every concert.
Right.
You asked me when you were writing Dream Variations.
Yeah.
Is this person playing? Is this person playing? And so,
No question.
as a member of the orchestra who, is talking to a composer who writes for us frequently, it's a nice feeling to know
Yeah.
that when you write for horn, you want to write for me.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Or oboe, Andy,
Right.
So on and
It's
so
absolutely
forth.
true. I mean, I think that was it. That's absolutely in my mind.
So, now that we're talking nuts and bolts,
Yeah.
why don't you tell me a little bit about how Jacob Bancks composes? Now, I know in this day and age, there are people who go from still on paper, and there are people who compose strictly on computer, and you seem to be somebody who does a little bit of both.
Yep.
And so how does that work for you?
So there's the beginning of the process for me is a very old-fashioned one that it begins on paper. I can usually look at a piece of music by a composer whose music I'm not familiar with, especially a young composer, and say this was written on the computer, and usually point to sort of oddities or things about the piece that are sort of taken as givens, which I think composers should question from the beginning.
Right. There's a level of like intentionality.
Absolutely.
When you're writing with your hand every single note, as
Yeah.
opposed to, well, let's just put a scale here.
People are always sort of in awe of composers. I mean, even if we write poor music, they're like, how do you write such poor music? I mean, how do you manage to do all that? How do you write for all those instruments? Is mainly one of the first things that we get asked. And they'll look at an orchestral score. I mean, I have the score to Into the Wild here, and they were like, well, you have to write for all those instruments, and how do you do it? It's really amazing, and it doesn't really seem that amazing from where I stand, because I always try, and this isn't true of every composer, but I try to conceive of the piece as a whole before I get into the details of instrumentation. I produce a draft, and which is a document from which I improvise the score.
Okay.
So it certainly isn't done in real time. I don't write all those parts, in the amount of time it would take. But I do have an accounting of the whole piece, and from that, then I get to work out the surface details, and I call them surface details because yes, this is a flute solo. With a little tweaking, could it be an oboe solo? Yes. I mean, the string accompaniment is tremolo, but could it be sort of a tremolando back and forth, or could that be in the horns instead of the strings? Right. Or could it be doubled? Those are all surface details. That stuff can be decided later once the essentials are decided in an earlier draft.
Right.
So it's unique to, and not unique to me, but it's particular to me in that I don't think certainly not every composer must do it, but I found it to be a very efficient and helpful way of getting from the initial inspiration to the actual finished score.
So talk to me about initial inspiration with Into the Wild. So we have two movements that are very different from one another.
Yeah.
Obviously part of the same piece, but
Yeah.
in terms of mood, entirely different.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so knowing that I was going to travel with a group of Minnesotans, who in high school Minnesotans. I remembered being in youth symphony. I remembered being from Minnesota, but I wanted to write a piece that they would like to play. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. In fact, I write all of my pieces with the musicians in mind, saying, and I said this once I wrote for a really fantastic mezzo-soprano, and it was a big concert in New York that it was going to be for. And one of the things I said to her on the phone was, well, one of my main goals is to make you sound good. And she paused, and she's like, I like that. I mean, it was, there are going to be some composers, certainly. I mean, I have encountered many, and I myself held many of the same attitudes that is some sort of low position to take, or there's something sort of cheap or tawdry. But nobody listens to music to be tortured. We all listen to be edified and elevated and enlightened. And it's funny because it's great that it ended up getting programmed on Postcards from the Wild West because it was really a postcard from Minnesota. I mean, not being the Wild West, but it was really written to bring some American music, some new American music to Argentina. I knew we were going to be hearing a lot of Argentine music. The orchestra was going to play Ginastera, and so I didn't feel the need to make it Argentina specific. It felt more important to me that I made it sort of Minnesota specific, so that we can describe, because there's some. I mean, you think about Patagonia, the region in southern Argentina, which is very similar to the region in northern Minnesota in terms of natural beauty. So that's where the first movement comes from. Was that, well, of course, here, and it isn't sort of, it's a small world after all, but just kind of like, trying to find bridges between cultures, and we certainly have many things in common, and one of them is sort of this natural beauty. And then the second one was, ever since I was a high schooler, actually, I've always loved F. Scott Fitzgerald. And so it seemed like, because wilderness was kind of the theme of the piece, that if we had sort of the natural wilderness in the beginning, that we could have the kind of moral wilderness that F. Scott Fitzgerald describes in his books, particularly this side of paradise, which is everybody knows Gatsby, which is an amazing work. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't mean to downplay Gatsby at all, but if you read this side of paradise, you start to, it's just an alternate moral universe.
So we have a lot of thoughts, we have a lot of ideas.
Yeah.
So, and composers are asked to do this frequently, sure, but help us figure out how you have these ideas and how they become music. And to me, when I listen to your piece, it's obvious.
Yeah.
I've read the program notes.
Right.
I've heard the piece. And there's kind of been this struggle throughout music history of, program notes and pieces. And,
we haven't faced that on Masterworks at all, have we? Symphony Fantastique, right, exactly.
And so, I could make a cartoon about you.
Someone could, yes, exactly. Someone should. It's a great idea.
But, so just talk to me a little bit about,
how do you get...
How do your thoughts become music? For me, sometimes my thoughts are music.
Yeah.
And for someone who isn't immersed in the music that we're making, it may sound strange that there's always a tune going in my head.
Right.
But
so the ways in which composers take abstract ideas, particularly non-musical ideas, and translate them into music, the number of ways that can be done is greater than the number of composers there are, right? Like, there's just a million ways to do it. Berlioz sort of set the tone with Symphonie Fantastique. I mean, it is the ultimate program piece. I mean, that's where we get the name programmatic music, because he says you have to read the program notes. That would have been absurd to so many people.
As a musician, as a person who's studied music history in school, and I really like stories. I kind of want to know where Beethoven did his grocery shopping. You know what I mean?
Right.
And what kind of friends he had, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And one thing that's super great about working with living composers is I run into Jacob Bancks at Hy-V.
Right.
Actually, I ran into you like the day before you left for Argentina.
Oh yeah,
and you were like
at Hy-V.
stockpiling.
I remember this.
Baby supplies.
That's right. Exactly. It was
to me, when you say everything is part of everything, it's that part of myself as a musician is the Quad Cities.
No
is
question.
The Quad Cities Symphony.
Absolutely.
Is everything about it.
Right.
And the symphony is also a result of, not just myself, but its sound is a result of who I am as a person, and what I've picked up along the way. And in your piece, I could list composers that I hear, but a person I know less than you might be offended by all the influences. But we've talked before, and we are a sum of all the parts and everything.
Absolutely,
that we picked up.
absolutely.
And so in the first movement, to me, it has. When you're saying that I want to make this American music,
right?
And one of the first composers everybody thinks about in American music is Copland,
right?
And if you listen to Copland, which is on
the program, thankfully after me,
right? And then you listen to Jacob Bancks. There's Copland in there,
no question.
It's definitely Jacob Bancks, but you hear Copland for sure.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I mean, everything you're describing is exactly what the piece is actually about, which is about you can't escape your origin.
Right.
We're all from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're from southern Minnesota or the Quad Cities.
Right.
You're from somewhere and you can't like get away from it. And in a way, whether you're canoeing out in the wilderness or whether you leave St. Paul and move to the big city and live this wild life and, you know, die a tragic death, you can't atomize yourself and sort of think that this has nothing to do with you. So yes, I mean that you're what you're hitting on is exactly right. That's everything I'm trying to say.
If you had a hope for the listener
Uh-huh.
in the concert hall, if you had to give them, you know, one sentence about, like, you know, they've read the program notes, they're in the concert hall, they're there to hear your piece. What is your hope for them?
I think in a generic sense, like sort of the hope that I would have for any listener of any of my pieces. I just hope we all come away from this with a greater understanding of our shared human experience. But I do hope that people will come away and say, it sounds odd to say this, but a human being wrote this, and human beings played this, and I understand, or I see and understand my own humanity more through this experience.
I think that is a wonderful background to
Thank
give
you.
everybody before this concert.
Well,
thanks again for
yeah,
hanging out with me.
This
and
was
talking about
great.
music
It worked
and-
out. The timing worked out well. Thanks a
man.
lot, Mark.
Yep.